I've talked a lot about horror games on this page, and specifically survival horror games, so I thought to myself, why not talk a little bit about the history of where survival horror games came from? So what sets survival horror apart from its greater genre of horror? Well, usually it has combat and puzzles. You're going to be focusing on both. There's a time whenever you're going to have to consider, should I run away from this enemy? Because you're going to be limited in a lot of ways. Maybe in movement, maybe in ammo, maybe in resources. There's resource management, and not only resource management, but inventory management. You're going to have a small inventory usually that's going to be very limited, and you're going to have to pick and choose what you take with you. And the first semblance of the survival horror genre actually appears in 1981 with a game called AX2 on the PET 2001. This was a very simple game. All you really had to do was escape a spaceship. But what did it introduce that was unique? Well, it was one of the first games that had a permanent enemy that was unkillable follow you throughout the entire gameplay experience. And yes, this game was inspired by Ridley Scott's Alien. And not even a year later, in 1982, a game called Haunted House appears. And Haunted House actually has all the staples of the genre, but very lightly done. It had inventory management, and it had an unkillable enemy that chased you all the time. It had puzzles that you had to solve, but it was extremely light on the story and whatnot. So where does this genre go from here? Well, funnily enough, in 1989, the reigning king of survival horrors, Capcom, comes out with a game called Sweet Home. And this is really the first technical survival horror. But it's funny enough that the first survival horror was also an RPG. This game, though, had it all. It had everything you would expect. It had quick time events, it had cinematic moments, it had multiple endings, it was all about a ghost story, it had permanent deaths, it went from moving from combat to going into puzzles, and it even had text logs you could read over. This game had literally everything that would make up the survival horror genre. And while I was reading about this game, actually, it made me think of another game more recently called Fear and Hunger. You should check that one out. But moving on, the game that would look most like any modern incarnation of the genre comes out in 1992. Alone in the Dark would come out and have what we would call the classic staples of a survival horror. And that was things like the fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited ammo in a 3D environment. But Alone in the Dark was kind of a true setup to the genre as a whole. And quite literally, 4 years later, the, again, reigning champion of survival horror, Capcom comes out with Resident Evil, probably the most well-known, most beloved, maybe second if you're a Silent Hill fan, game in the entire genre. Capcom is the one who comes up with the term survival horror for this game because they didn't want to just market it as a normal horror game experience, but they were like, no, this is a survival horror game. It's different. And that's where the name came from. And yes, this game redefines the genre and sets everything up and is the staple core foundation of survival horror. And actually, it was weirdly enough planned as a remake to 1989's Sweet Home, but it kind of went in a different direction. There are a lot of similarities. And with Resident Evil's release in 1996, this actually spawns an entire golden age of survival horror games, with games coming out at an insane pace, ranging from games like Silent Hill not only 3 years later, White Day, A School Called Labyrinth, a Korean take on the genre, Fatal Frame, Clock Tower, Parasite Eve, potentially, and just a whole slew of tons and tons of games came out during this period. But as the years went on and technology advanced, the genre kind of fell into a slump for a little while, and in 2005, Capcom does it again with Resident Evil 4, again, redefines the entire genre for better or worse, depending on how you look at it, as these survival horror games were starting to have to compete with action games in the space. And of course, the genre still lives on to this day with many different iterations and cool titles filling out the space. And I've mentioned quite a few myself, but what do you think of the survival horror genre? What's your favorite survival horror game? And as always, thanks for watching.